Yeah, before I begin, just like pass around this book, flip through the pages. There's no particular reason other than it has really cool pictures, and I want this to be kind of audiovisual. And that book is gonna blow your minds, and that's good. So, yeah, and let me know if at any point I'm not speaking clearly or loud enough. I wanted to first of all, kind of like have a show of hands about who knows about qualia computing. Okay, excellent, cool. Yeah, for those who don't know it, that's my website. I'm part of the Qualia Research Institute, and we're doing research on consciousness, assuming it actually has a mathematical structure, and inferring the properties of it. I figure that since not all of you raised your hands, I might kind of like talk very briefly about some important concepts that will come in handy later. Also, kind of the structure of the talk is going to be maybe like 50 minutes or so of talking, and then I'll just like leave it for Q&A afterwards. And of course, if you feel like a burning question, definitely feel free to ask in the meantime. Okay, so first of all, personal identity. For those of you who know me, you will probably be sick of me repeating this, but it's just like super important. It shows up all the time, and so many discussions would be a lot more tractable and easy if we actually have a vocabulary for it. So personal identity is basically this philosophical question of is it the case that when you wake up in the morning tomorrow, is it actually going to be you? Like who is that person going to be? How do you know you actually continue to exist from one moment to another? And that's kind of like the intuitive common sense view, which is called closed individualism, which is you start existing when you're born and you stop existing when you die. Although, of course, if you believe in souls, then you may have something like you start existing when you're born and then you never stop existing. You just kind of go into heaven or hell or whatever. But you're still like a separate, ontologically unitary self that is different from the entire universe. So that's kind of like the main premise of closed individualism. And we're kind of built around this notion. We evolved to basically take that for granted. But when you examine the facts, like, hey, the fact that, like every 7 years all of your atoms get replaced, or the fact that we lose memories and we fabricate memories, and the fact that you can have like brain damage and then you may forget who you are. And, like, there's a lot of challenging issues with closed individualism. And that definitely is something that you start questioning if you start doing psychedelics a lot. But there's like alternatives. There's like two other views. There's empty individualism. That's the view that you're only a moment of experience. In this view, yourself is not really in your body. Rather, your body is an experience machine. Mostly your brain. All the other parts of your body are important as well. But basically, you have an experience machine that is producing time slices of experience, and you're just one of them. It so happens that the structure of these time slices are correlated, so that from one moment to the next, there's a lot of memories and sensations shared, but they're shared superficially. I mean, it's kind of like looking at the color blue in a given place and then looking at the color blue in a different place. That doesn't make the exact same entity. The continuity in this case would be a complete illusion. And a lot of physicists, they take this view, because it's like, hey, like, yeah, on any given moment in time, you're just like, like a bundle of atoms, and that's all you are. And continuity is an illusion. And then there's like the third view, which I'm gonna be taking for granted today, which is open individualism. This is the idea that we're all one consciousness. And there's it's definitely something that tends to be thought of as like, like very hippie, a very Eastern view of, we're all one consciousness and so on. And those who talk about it don't tend to provide really solid arguments for why this is the case. But I think there's very strong rigorous philosophical cases to think that we're all one consciousness. Just to name one, for instance, if you look at quantum mechanics, the Feynman diagrams, it seems that the behavior of an electron moving forwards in time is exactly the same as a positron moving backwards in time. In other words, antimatter might be just matter moving backwards in time. And Feynman and John Wheeler had a conversation where they speculated that the entire universe is just one electron moving backwards and forwards in time, interfering with itself. And in that sense, we are all that one electron, the big electron. We're just in different parts of the pattern of self-interference. And that's a very, very trippy view, but I think it's worth considering, and I'm going to take it for granted, because I'm basically going to build a completely new version of ethics around that. I mean, a lot of ethics is based on, you know, guilt and shame and fear of what others might think. But if you take open individualism seriously, then, you know, harming others is equivalent to harming yourself in the future. Yeah, you're really just being irrational when you're hurting others. And yeah, there's a case to kind of like restructure ethics around that. I'm going to mention just like 2 more words before kind of getting into the weeds of the talk. So one is valence. I'm a big fan of exploring valence. That's the core of my research. Valence is the pleasure-pain axis. Basically what makes experience worthwhile. You can have like all sorts of rich experiences that, you know, are colorful and have texture, but they're completely bland emotionally. I don't really care about them. I care about the, you know, deeply emotional, powerful, pleasurable, intense states. Like that's where it seems like value actually seems to be located. And of course you have like the 2 axes. You have extremely positive, extremely negative experiences. On the extreme positive, you might have things like MDMA and 5-MeO, DMT. On the extreme negative, you might have things like cluster headaches and kidney stones. And the thing is, like, we think that there's a matter of fact about whether you're having a good or bad experience. It's as much of a physical reality as is the rest mass of an electron, even though nowadays it's fashionable to think that, no, you know, any experience is equally good or bad. It just depends on how you look at it. But you can always just like turn back and say, well, okay, how you look at it is maybe where the valence is, and that's fine. And to some extent, that's true. But yeah, I mean, there's extremely high valence and extremely low valence states with very little cognition. Cognition seems to be fairly irrelevant for the purpose of pleasure and pain. You seem to have a question?
Yeah. So it's like binary. So it's like binary in a sense, like 1, 4 plus 2.
Yeah. That's I would say it's trinary. So there's positive, negative, and neutral. You can have an intensely neutral experience. And you can have like a mixture, you can basically have like mixed experiences. And you can have, for example, an experience that is both extremely pleasurable and extremely painful. And that's different than an experience that is extremely neutral. Now, which of those matter more morally? It's a really interesting question. Like, is, you know, like, you know, being on a concert, like, really enjoying the music, but the speakers really suck and you're hearing all of these dissonance and you're trying to enjoy the music. Just like this mixed experience. Is that better than, you know, just perfect, like, you know, blandness, you know, like the sort of thing you experience on SSRIs, or, you know, when you're completely apathetic? Which of those is better? I think that's a good question. But when you go to like pure experiences, you know, pure heavenly experience or pure hellish experiences, I think the answer is pretty clear. Okay, so the kind of like the spirit of my approach to things is to combine exploration and synthesis. I think exploration is really important. I love Burning Man for a lot of reasons, and one of them is a deep philosophical reason I'm going to get into. But exploration is not enough. I mean, I think to a large extent, when you explore all sorts of different states of consciousness and all sorts of really valuable art or really valuable modes of being, that's fascinating. But then they may not necessarily stick, and you may not necessarily be able to remember the most valuable things. I think it's, in the ideal case, you should be able to let go for a while and then synthesize for a while, so that you don't miss out on what you experience. You can actually build from it. I get the feeling at times that, you know, society is kind of divided in a bimodal way, where you have the explorers and the synthesizer, in a kind of like a cartoon way, conservatives and liberals. And in a sense, if you only synthesize, you will just get stuck in a local maxima, and what's the point? And if you only explore, you'll just be doing complex random walks, but you're not getting anywhere, I think. And that's why, you know, I may complain sometimes when somebody is just like extremely open and doesn't put any effort in synthesizing, but I think that that's a huge loss of value. So I'm never going to say something like, oh, that was a weird experience, I'm going to leave it at that. It's like, no, that goes in my book, and I'm going to try to figure out what the hell happened there. Like, for example, salvia. What the hell is going on with salvia? That's a really tricky thing to figure out, actually. Maybe one of the toughest. But we should try to figure out what the hell is going on with Salvia. I'm not going to do it in this talk, though. Okay, so yes, the spirit is exploration plus the synthesis. And I equate these to kind of the dichotomy between alchemy and chemistry. I mean, you can, in kind of alchemical works, you will have some interesting results, but you can only go so far. If you actually figure out what the underlying rules are, you can build from there and create completely and entirely new worlds from scratch that you wouldn't be able to do if you don't have a complete synthesis of what's going on. Yes, and another thing for background is that I am generally very skeptical of the relevance of what people tend to say for the simple reason that what comes out of people's mouths in general is guided by two things. One is our evolutionary programs, survival programs, and the second one is the status algorithms. Basically, when you have a particular community, they express a particular set of cognitive and personality traits. You have this thing that's called runaway signaling dynamics, where basically, if we're all like super open to experience around here, we may kind of like end in a competition of who's the most open to experience. If we're all super conservative, we may end up in a competition of who's like the most conservative, and so on. I don't think that's a necessarily very good dynamic. Maybe good for exploration, finding out like new stuff, but it's not good for synthesis. So yeah, just wanted to put that there. Okay, so now let's get on to the actual subject. So, consciousness versus pure replicators. So right now, at this point in time, the economy is divided into roughly three things. There's three big categories of goods. Oh, by the way, can people hear me well? Is the sound dissonant? Is the sound acceptable? Cool. Okay. Yeah. So the economy is divided into roughly three components. You have goods and services for survival. You have goods and services for acquiring power and reproduction, and then you have goods and services for consciousness exploration. Why is it divided this way? Well, all of these are, in a sense, like spandrels from our evolution, especially the exploration of consciousness. You have a lot of people, I mean, nowadays, maybe 99% of people who, they come back from work, and rather than deciding to go to another, second job and earn a little bit extra income and have like one more extra kid, they choose to instead spend that money and go to the movies and waste that economic power on experiences. Now, I think that's great. That's actually our saving grace. The fact that is happening right now, that we are wasting massive amounts of resources on experiences as opposed to reproduction, I think that's really important. That's the thing that may actually save us from experiencing pure replicator hell. And I'm going to get into details about like what I'm talking about here. So, a pure replicator is an entity that spends all of its resources on making copies of itself. Now, if you have a particular ecosystem, it doesn't matter if it's like information ecosystem, it doesn't matter if it's a biological system or whatever it may be, you can figure out that if you have like two sets of entities, one kind of entity that spends a fraction of its resources on making copies of itself, and a fraction of resources into painting the world blue, something arbitrary, versus another entity that spends 100% of its resources on making copies of itself. At first, you may think, well, they're kind of equivalent, but very quickly you will start to see an exponential increase on the latter one, and the first one is it was destined to evolutionary oblivion. In the case of us humans, using resources for experiences, spending that extra money on movies or drugs or meditation or things like that, rather than on having kids. That is a strange evolutionary anomaly. I don't think that is like by default going to continue. If it's going to continue, there has to be some additional conditions, and the conditions are currently not completely clearly there, or at least like alternative reproductive strategies may get there instead. Now, it is worth asking, like, why is it the case that we care so much about experiences by default anyway? Like, how is it the case that we are not already just pure replicators? Well, the reason is that learning from the world is actually very adaptive evolutionarily. Definitely in the ancestral savanna, being curious, about is this root edible? Can I actually eat these fruits? Can I build this hut or not? All of that is very, very useful. So actually curiosity, even though it may not have an immediate payoff at first, in the long term has a tremendous payoff. But you could imagine that changing the selection pressures would actually make curiosity not necessarily good. If being an accountant is the number one way in which you can get money, then curiosity may not be advantageous at all. And in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that at least in the extremes of curiosity, you have a drop in fertility. And I think that's definitely a tragedy, and we should be kind of open to the idea that there's a general trend towards a diminishing of interest in consciousness. And if so, what can we do? I mean, we shouldn't just cross our arms and have like wishful thinking and think everything is going to be sorted out. I'll just go on and have my own intense, interesting experiences. I don't think it works that way, or at least those who think that way are destined for evolutionary oblivion. And I don't want that to happen. I want consciousness to win. I don't want pure replicators to win. I'm part of a team consciousness. Okay, so now I'm gonna actually get into like the theory of morality. So there's a lot of very interesting research by people like Ken Wilber, like the meta-moderns, people who are like creating models for how people develop psychologically over time, and they make this very interesting distinction between states and stages. That you can have, you can be in sort of like an archaic state, archaic stage, where you kind of like interpret God as a literal entity, a bearded man in the sky, and even in that stage, in that developmental stage, you can still have profound mystical experiences. You can achieve satori, except that when you come back, you will interpret it with your own framework. And I think this is a very valuable way of looking at it. That you can, like the various states of consciousness, especially high valence, boundary dissolving, and personal identity questioning states, they can be interpreted from any stage, and they have their own interpretations. But I would add like a third dimension, which is like theory of ethics. And the thing is, like, you could be at any stage of development and have a different, any one of the following theories of ethics, I'm going to say. So I've definitely met people who would, by any standards, be enlightened. Daniel Ingram, for example, he's acknowledged as probably being, if anybody's enlightened in the world, he probably is. And you can basically use a reference network of people who are enlightened that can recognize each other about like who's actually enlightened. The highest developmental stages, but they may still not have a good theory of ethics, because that's intellectual. And I'm sorry, but like the intellectual part also matters. It also matters. I think like the stages that the meditation it talks about is more about reducing neuroticism. It's like how to be okay with how things are, and I think like that's great for personal wellness. I don't think that's necessarily great for universal wellness. I think it's good to be neurotic about certain things. If you see the pace of evolution going somewhere you don't like, I think it's good to to be alarmed by it. So yeah, what I'm gonna say, it's purely intellectual. You could be super neurotic and get it. You could be enlightened and get it as well. So I basically describe the progression of theories of ethics as 4 stages. So stage number 1 is the battle between good and evil. And this is very common in Christianity and Islam and Judaism. Just this very childish notion. There's like fundamental evil out there, the darkness. And the forces of light, and they're in tension, and maybe that tension is manifesting in this realm, and we're all kind of like subtly either buying into the darkness or buying into the light. And I think like a lot of maybe up to 90% of people in the world kind of like implicitly buy into that. It's probably a very adaptive way of believing about ethics, but it leads to all sorts of problems. I mean, it leads to witch hunts. It leads to people having extreme prejudices about new evolutionary developments. Being uncurious because they already know what's good, what their tribe thinks is good. But then there's like the second stage, and in my reading, maybe this is kind of like the typical at places like Burning Man, There's definitely at places that like I would say, yeah, spiritual development organizations and Buddhism, which is, and Hinduism especially, it's the balance between good and evil. You know, people who is like, after a while, they come to the conclusion that, you know, maybe evil is part of reality. It's just two sides of the same coin. You know, and you can't have good without evil. That sort of thing is what they would say. That you have to learn to let go and accept evil. Maybe accept the evil part of yourself, accept your darkness, work with it. You know, and I think that's a good antidepressant approach to ethics. That's maybe good for actually, you know, come to terms with the dark side in you. But I don't think it actually works out as a theory of ethics. I mean, it has all sorts of problems. To start with, the people who believe in the balance between good and evil tend to use this as an antidepressant, as a mood booster. It's kind of like, oh yeah, shit happened, but you know, everything balances out, so it's okay. It's like, okay, well, like, why are you not okay feeling shitty right now? And yeah, so I think it's some kind of like strange delusion to think that balance between good and evil is kind of the ultimate understanding. And definitely a lot of people in psychedelic states, they reach that and they stay there. And then they become very, they proselytize that. You know, the balance between good and evil. That's the aim of spiritual development. But I think that's just stage number 2 out of 4. So stage number 3 is gradients of wisdom. And you will see some people like, Sam Harris or Ken Wilber, who I would say are like very squarely in this stage. Which is like, hey, actually there's some cultures that are really shitty for human flourishing. It is not the case that everything balances out. There's some ways of arranging things in good and bad ways. There are genes that really suck that we probably shouldn't have. It's not the case that, you know, having a child by the will of God will necessarily lead to good consequences. Every child is a genetic experiment. You wouldn't write, you wouldn't push unedited code to production. Why do we push unedited genetic code into people? It's insane. I mean, it's, you know, all these diseases and, you know, Huntington's diseases, depression tendencies, low pain thresholds. We just kind of like, you know, think that this is just like part of normal life, and we kind of like get on with it. But no, there's a good direction in which we can improve things, and wishful thinking is not good. So people who are in gradients of wisdom, they don't necessarily have a good framework for how to decide whether something is good or bad, but they do have good intuitions and heuristics usually. They tend to kind of like have like a good way of kind of like nudging situations. They realize that generally conflict, you know, discord is not really good, but sometimes it's really important, and you shouldn't, you know, just apply a universal rule of being calm and non-neurotic is always good. It's not the case. Sometimes screaming is important. Yeah, so these people, as a general rule, they don't have hard and fast rules. They have heuristics, and they're very open-minded. And yeah, I would say that's a step up from balance between good and evil. Again, balance between good and evil is a way of dealing with one's own neuroticism, not really a solid theory of ethics. And finally, the 4th stage, and I'm arrogant enough to say I'm in that stage. Although I'm not enlightened, I'm definitely very neurotic. I'm not spiritually developed, but intellectually, yes, and I'm arrogant about that. This is consciousness versus pure replicators, where basically you see that reality is this complex interplay between what consciousness wants and patterns that are really good at making copies of themselves. You know, patterns that are really good at making copies of themselves could be things like memes, you know, like shitty memes, like that is like, you know, like it's bullying people is a good example, or what is this called? Hazing. You know, hazing is a really stupid pure replicator. It's, you know, pointless suffering that we apply on each other. But also, yeah, a lot of religions you can be described as pure replicators in one way or another, ideologies. But most of all, particular genes can be understood as pure replicators. If there's a gene, for example, that makes you experience disgust with people of other ethnicities, that's probably a pure replicator gene at the evolutionary limit, because it's basically shielding yourself from recombining with others, and it's not basically leaving a line open for genetic exploration.
And organic viruses.
Can you say more about that?
Organic viruses are pure replicators.
Oh yes, organic viruses tend to be pure replicators. Yes, they're just like making copies of themselves at the expense of you and me. That's like what's the point of that? I don't think so. I mean, they can be reutilized for the purpose of consciousness, which happens when we basically use viruses as genetic vectors for genetic engineering to improve ourselves, make us more robust against disease. Yes.
So in this case, where do we put like animals? Are they on the ethical stages, like 1 or like something between 0 to 1?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I would say these are like intellectual stages. So probably animals are not even playing. I mean, like they would be maybe stage 0
Like
because
they spend resources for experiences.
oh, in that sense, right. Well, you could be a pure replicator and be on stage 4. You could be a pure replicator and know that the battle is between pure replicators and consciousness, but root for pure replicators, root for yourself. But no, animals, I mean, they tend to basically just respond to pleasure and pain, like us, but in less sophisticated ways. So I would say they're just not playing in that space. Although, at the evolutionary limit, yes, some animals would converge on pure replicators and some animals would converge to consciousness. We definitely seem to be on the path to consciousness, although it's not a guarantee. But yeah, I can give you an example of an animal that converges to pure replicators. I mean, I forget, there's like a sea amoeba, for example, that basically it has a brain that its whole purpose is to find a place to feed, and basically just like gets stuck. It just like anchors itself on that place, and then eats its own brain, and then just like feeds off of the water. So it had like this experience engine, but just got rid of it because it just wasn't good for making copies of itself anymore. So it's kind of like at the point where you're like, yeah, basically sacrificing positive experience generators for the purpose of making copies. That I would say, yeah, that's a pure replicator. I mean, that's in that sense, I guess humans are probably the only species that are really on the path of consciousness winning for now, and it's not guaranteed by any means. Yeah, are there any questions about the 4 stages? Yeah.
So you said all animals are pure replicators. When you say that dogs do things that can't be explained by pure replication,
That is a good question. So, yeah, I mean, this is tricky because, I mean, dogs survive to a large extent because they produce good experiences in humans. So we have like this symbiotic relationship with it. You may even think of like dogs as an extension of humanity or a symbiosis with humans. In which case, yeah, they would be with us. They would be part of the consciousness team. And I think like definitely a lot of dog owners have this mentality of I would rather my dog be happy than reproduce a lot. And I think that's great. I mean like that's kind of exporting our mentality there. So what I want to kind of like touch upon next is that once you kind of like think of reality and ethics in terms of consciousness and pure replicators, the trick is going to, on the one hand, stay true to consciousness, and on the other hand, not be naive about the game theory that emerges from this. I will basically give you an example, which is there's one very, very promising avenue for consciousness to win that I'm exploring theoretically at the time, which is basically utilizing MDMA-like states of consciousness. I guess like for a little bit of background, it's like MDMA is wonderful, extremely pro-social, it makes you love everybody, definitely is something that turns people into team consciousness. It's anti-addiction, and addictions are pure replicators. When you do something out of compulsion rather than because it's enjoyable, that means that you're doing it just to replicate that pattern rather than to benefit consciousness. And MDMA is anti-addiction, it's healing. The problem is MDMA is really neurotoxic. I mean, it seems to let a lot of calcium into neurons, and you can't really do it very much. I would love it if somebody finds a way of having an MDMA-like experience like once a week. And maybe, sure, it could be a little bit harmful, maybe as harmful as, drinking three drinks, 3 beers or something like that. Because then you could do it all your life, every week, take MDMA. I think like that would be a very viable path for consciousness to win, because across nations and throughout the world, people would realize, hey, like there's these hyper valuable states. There's a reason why to let go of my attachments, why to let go of my sense of identity as part of my community or my ethnicity or my set of memes, and embrace my identity in terms of the light of consciousness. And that would happen in China, it would happen in India, it would happen in Africa, in America, and I think like that would be wonderful. Now, there is a problem here, and that is that not everybody responds to MDMA in the same way. Actually, your response to MDMA seems to be mediated by the COMP gene, and that's something that modulates oxytocin release. So there's about like 20% of people in the population who their experience with MDMA is euphoric. I mean, they may have a pleasant experience, but it's not heart-opening. It's not something that makes them feel closer to others, doesn't make them love others, or helps them let go of themselves. It's just kind of, like an amphetamine or something like that. And you can imagine if we are collectively using MDMA states of consciousness to generate a group identity based on consciousness, those who don't have that response to MDMA could actually start to band up together to overrule everybody else. They would basically have this secret communication of like, oh yeah, I don't feel this. Do you feel this? How about we could band together and take over. So on any community that is extremely open, extremely sharing, I mean that's wonderful. It basically enables, reduces frictional costs. Any high trust society tends to be really good from an evolutionary standpoint. It's just evolutionarily unstable. As soon as you have a defector, a way of actually not cooperating but seeming like you're cooperating, over the long run, the community is completely taken over by those. And that's a big problem that has to be solved. Yes?
So basically you're saying that there's a board for replicators and consciousness, and you're trying to basically inviting us to team consciousness in a sense. But can't we, or in addition to this, can't we reduce this state into, again, positives and negatives in a sense, and make it a loop actually? Like, not stages, but it turns out into a loop, which we can call maybe stage 5 from that point of view. Because like, when you reach to the fourth, again, like, you can still reduce it to positive and negative. It's a war, it's like, it's directional. So like, it loops back.
Well, I don't think you can really collapse consciousness versus pure replicators into the battle between good and evil unless you're making a cartoon out of it. And the reason is that it's a more sophisticated theory of actually what's going on. I mean, like, in the theory of good versus evil, you don't have something like, oh, evil is something that is good at making copies of itself. I mean, the compression wouldn't work, I would think. Okay, so I'm going to explore a few other ways in which we can help team consciousness. So I'm very into alternative reproductive strategies. So I think something we ideally would and should aim for is increase the fertility rate of burners. I think like, I don't know, but I bet that burners on average have fewer kids than the average person in the population. On the article I wrote about Burning Man last year, I did an in-depth research on all the census of Burning Man and all the reports of what kind of people go there, and it's insane. I mean, you have something like 30% of people at Burning Man have a graduate degree, 80% have an undergraduate degree. Like the level of education is insane, and the level of openness to experience and conscientiousness. Like I would say, there's extremely valuable people in here. But yes, chances are they're having maybe one kid on average, probably less. That's not gonna fly from an evolutionary standpoint. We'll probably not see that as kind of like a big problem for the next 20 years. But imagine in 50 years, we may not have enough burners to actually hold a Burning Man. Now, I don't know how to increase the fertility rate at Burning Man, but that's something I would love thoughts on. If anybody can think about it. Sorry? Yeah, holes in the condoms. Well, that also increases STD, which is also a pure replicator, and that would be a bit of a tension. Oh no, but I think like matching algorithms. That's there's definitely a lot of camps here working on matching algorithms, and that's probably something to look into. Like who is somebody not only you would be willing to have a kid with, you would be willing to have like 4 kids with. Okay, so like, I mean, other reproductive strategies. Okay, so I'm LGBT myself, and I mean, I think by my natural tendencies, I would probably not have kids. I think that's kind of a shame, at least not genetic kids. Now, I understand, believe me, I understand that there's this wonderful, love that you express by adopting a kid. But again, that's not evolutionarily stable. Like again, like kid adopters have, wonderful, agreeable genes that will die out. So I don't think that's very wise necessarily. I know this, I sound like an asshole, but again, I think this is one of the places where it makes sense to be so.
A question.
Yes?
Do you think it makes sense from like sort of
another alternative. Moving forward, last year at Burning Man, I had, I was very conflicted because I saw kind of the battle of consciousness versus pure replicators as pretty hopeless. Mostly because the genes that make you identify with yourself and make you identify with your genes do seem to have a very strong advantage. I mean, if you consider a population of people who identify with consciousness and a population who identify with their genes, the one who identifies with their genes is delusional by my standards. But they will have the actual replicator incentives to grow very quickly, whereas those who identify with consciousness will probably be willing to give resources to everybody. It's like, oh, I am you, I love you, I love you. But you're also giving resources to those who are not going to cooperate. So that's not going to be evolutionarily stable. So the solution, and this is one approach. Sorry, not the solution, but one very promising approach. It's child molesters, and because that's an evolutionary strategy. Like if you're not actually being if women are not paying attention to you and you're not actually going to be able to have long-term relationship with somebody, raping from the point of view of your genes kind of makes sense. And we have a ton of rapists in our gene pool. So I think if you look objectively at your genes, you're going to come to the conclusion, okay, some of this is crap mixed in. You shouldn't identify with it necessarily. And I think one approach in this case, it would be to basically band up together with a larger set of people, maybe 100, maybe more. You all pull of our genes, and we make a rational, intelligent decision about how to recombine them in ways that we explore the state space of consciousness. And basically we encourage agreeableness, prosociality, intelligence, conscientiousness, high working memory, loving for others, oxytocin, and all of those things. And then you should be okay if your genes don't make it into it. Because if you keep that super strong attachment, like my genes have to make it somehow, that's again pure replicator stalking. And it's not going to work out that way. Now I recognize that our drive to identify with our genes is just so intense. It's extremely intense right now. Even though we don't admit it, I'm sure it's super intense. Just one example is, again, with adoption, people like to believe that they love their adopted children as much as they love their biological children. But all the research shows that's just not the case in terms of parental investment, amount of hours they dedicate, the resources, money they're willing to give to the adopted child, and so on. Cool. Is that the speakers? Oh, it's feedback. Is it feedback?
It's the wind.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah, so because our drive to identify with our genes is so intense right now, we may need to kind of like approach these very slowly. And here's like one way to get there. Basically, you could have a program where you the government or international consciousness dedicated organization has the following scheme. So what they do is, let's say you and your partner, you want to have a kid. And how this is going to play out is they say, okay, we will recombine your genes and your partner's genes, and your kids will have half of their genetic makeup will be the combination of you and your partner, and the other half will be a set of genes that we have kind of like vetted for prosociality and health and working memory and oxytocin and so on. So in one generation or two, of course, like this will be extremely controversial at first, but in one generation or two, you will see that the kids, the kids who actually are part of this program, they will be top of the class, they will be winning Fields medals, Nobel Prizes, and everybody's going to start to get jealous. And in a sense, even from the selfish gene perspective, it will start to make sense to actually go through this, because if you want your genes to have any chance of being there in the future, having even just like a half of them as you would have otherwise still increases the chances versus zero, which would be the alternative. So that's like one other possibility for alternative reproduction. Then of course you have kind of like full non-genetic reproduction, which would be creating consciousness machines from scratch. I know that there's a lot of people, especially in the circles I hang out with, who believe in strong AI. They think if you program a computer just right, it can be conscious. I think that's very plausible for reasons I'm not going to get into for the time being. That there are not the usual reasons. I mean, a lot of people don't think digital computers can be conscious for dumb reasons. I think they cannot be conscious for other reasons. But yeah, no. However, you could basically build brains from scratch. Basically using stacks of in vitro neurons, and basically organize them in such a way that they produce very high valence. They're organized to basically live through gradients of bliss and be super intelligent. Now that would be kind of like almost, it's kind of you sacrifice your own genes completely for the benefit of consciousness. You just create this other version of the light of consciousness that is a lot better in many ways, and you kind of like accept that, yeah, maybe that is the future. That's of course like very hard for us to do, at least in the states of consciousness in which I have identified the most intensely with consciousness. I'm totally okay with a world that just has like nothing resembling like humans, but that in which consciousness is extremely intelligent and it is extremely blissful. I think like that would be extremely valuable. But most of the time I identify partly as a human, and that doesn't seem very appealing to me. I don't feel like I would be there. However, again, if open individualism is true, and we are all the light of consciousness, hey, creating a heaven world, you would be there, even if there's like no causal continuity or not genetic continuity, because all of those are illusory continuities to begin with. Cool. All right. Yeah. Okay. A couple more, two more topics, and then I'm gonna open it up for a Q&A. So, one of them is hyperesthesia. Hyperestheticity. This is a term by Nick Land. Basically, it's the idea of ideas that makes themselves real. I think consciousness is extremely powerful, and we can see this at Burning Man, where basically it's not the case that you can explain what goes on in the universe without consciousness. And the reason is that there's a lot of ideas that to actually get them and make them happen, they have this irreducible complexity component that you need to understand all of the pieces of information at once for the thing to actually be built or the thing to actually work. So in this sense, consciousness really has this powerful way of completely altering reality. There's like a strong version of this. I call the strong Klon hypothesis, which in philosophy would be basically called Herculean idealism, which is the idea that actually there's just mind. We're all in the mind of God, and basically whatever you believe it's true becomes true. in this view, basically, we all together right now believe that we're in the moon. We would be in the moon. And the reason why this doesn't happen individually is because you need kind of like a threshold of a number of consciousness bits to actually make this happen. I think that's unlikely. However, the weak version of Tlon hypothesis, I think is totally real. I mean, basically, fetching in the space of irreducible complexity for ideas, you can completely alter the world entirely. I mean, again, one of those examples is alternative reproductive strategies. If you can find a way to benefit consciousness in a way that is not evolutionarily naive, you can transform the history of consciousness on this planet forever. And it's not going to be, just more of the same. There's actually a sharp discontinuity at this point. Which is, one of the reasons why psychedelics can be so transformative, not only at the level of the self, but collectively, because with psychedelics you have more consciousness. There's more information in your experience. So the size of irreducibly complex ideas becomes larger. There's just some ideas that you can't have unless you have a threshold amount of consciousness. Why, in part, so many great insights occur in psychedelics is because you don't have the energy or the consciousness to do it in normal states. Actually, figuring out in what ways consciousness is computationally useful is one other way to help team consciousness. Because you prevent it from, just being replaced by automata, rather than, becoming little quasi-robots that we don't necessarily have to think, we just need to do. If you find ways in which consciousness can, actually do computationally difficult tasks, then yeah, you're actually benefiting the cause of consciousness. I'm gonna kind of like finish out with kind of like tying together a couple things with pure replicators versus consciousness. So one of them, for example, is toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity, definitely a term. I think it's a real thing. If you bump up testosterone on people, they become more competitive, less empathetic. There's definitely a lot of trans men have experienced these. They have like these fabulous reports of how their psychology changed once they went through hormone replacement therapy. And in our frameworks, you basically become less of a resonator with others, so you become more of a metronome. You have your own inner frequency that you're trying to broadcast into the world. And in that sense, like toxic masculinity might be a manifestation of pure replicators. In the sense, it's like, it's just like this one pattern that really loves itself, just wants to see itself splattered all over the place. It's like, my art is the best art. Just like strong egos without a counterbalance of, actually caring about what matters in life, which is emotions and love and high villains. But you also have, on the opposite extreme, I hope nobody hates me for this, because toxic masculinity already kind of, it's like blaming a gender to some extent. We're gonna flip it around. Naive femininity, which is just being very open and loving for everybody, which is great on its own, but not evolutionarily stable. Because again, if you don't have a way of rooting out defectors, eventually your community just gets completely filled with defectors. That's just how it is. So you actually need to combine the two. You need to combine, resonating, beautiful femininity with game theory aware masculinity. Although, again, putting gender levels here is probably not appropriate because these are just patterns of qualia, and it's not really, there's not really ground truth to the genders to begin with. We could have been 3 genders, we could have been 17 genders if evolution had turned out differently. So there's not really kind of like an essence of each gender. But yeah, you can see this in kind of like a lot of places. For example, rap music tends to be more pure replicator focused. It's kind of like promoting the self, very egotistic. It's not necessarily all rap music, but there's like a general tendency. Whereas classical music tends to actually focus more on valence engineering, actually figuring out patterns that sound very interesting and expand your mind without kind of this, tribal pure replicator dynamic. So what I would encourage everybody here is to basically use the lens of consciousness versus pure replicators to analyze problems and cultural phenomena. It's like, why is this piece of media trash? it's not just a judgment. It's not because I'm just judgmental or not open. It's because it's just promoting a pattern that doesn't add value. I think it's okay to judge some pieces of media as really trashy for that reason. That they're just viruses in the mind. I think that's totally okay. And with that, I'll open up for Q&A. Yes.
Amazing, thank you. But like the framework feels like super incomplete in a sense, because like it feels like this framework is still stuck in the sense of duality. Like you are still burning all your energy to actually survive against replicators. So in a sense, like when you put it in a way, replicators versus consciousness, again, it's a dual state, like good versus evil. So your framework collapses into your first step, so it's incomplete in a sense.
I'm not sure about that, because you could have, consciousness could win. It could actually just completely win. And
there's no winning and losing in a sense. I mean, what you're saying, step 2, also applies to all things.
I'm not sure. We can talk about it offline.
It's like, it's called strange loops, like paradoxical loops. I mean, you're talking about computation in a sense, like the way you frame your solutions, it's still computationally. This is good, like this is like building blocks, you just said building blocks for enlightenment in means of intellectually, and then you propose some ways to go better places, to the point. Yes, the point is there, but the ways you are proposing lacks that enlightenment thing in a sense. And that enlightenment thing is the thing that duality versus non-duality, like it becomes, the cones, like paradoxical questions in Zen or in Asia.
Yeah, so, okay.
Those are lacking in this framework.
Okay, so I think, I understand your point, but I think that's different reference classes. So, non-duality in the sense of consciousness, that is a state of consciousness. That
it's
is
the loop again.
No. I think this makes sense. So, the enlightenment, the non-duality is a state of consciousness, but you could still talk about intellectually about enlightenment winning in the sense of enlightenment being the main state of consciousness around. I don't think that's...
Okay, I'm trying to tell is that there are things that with our current grammar, vocabulary, like voice, computation, taking names, putting them each other, making sentences and commuting information, like zeros and ones, I'm trying to tell that there's a state that there is no zero and ones.
Sure. And that's a state of consciousness, yes.
Okay.
And I think that's a very valuable state of consciousness.
But as you said, when...
Yeah, we can talk about it offline. Yeah.
Is this on? Tell me, what do you think are the most common positive states of consciousness and valence at Burning Man?
Oh, that's super interesting. I think like radical openness. When you approach somebody in a random camp and you just ask them what do you like about life? And the fact that people just go on a rant about what they like about life. That is telling about what their internal state is. Just this extreme openness. And to a large extent, why something like Burning Man can happen is because there's a very high barrier of entry. You need to be conscientious and open. You need to be not creeped out by naked people. And be willing to actually put in all the effort to make it happen. So there's huge barrier of entry that is psychological, cognitive and personality traits. Ideally, we could build something like that that requires less resources. It wouldn't be called Burning Man anymore, obviously, but I think it's a good proof of concept of something that we could do at a larger scale. But yeah, I don't advocate MDMA, obviously, because it's neurotoxic and all that, but I think I think part of the vibe of Burning Man is the fact that a lot of people take MDMA, and that's definitely a big component of it. And the boundary dissolving, ego dissolution of acid, for sure as well.
What class of computational problems do you think are best targeted by consciousness?
That is a great question. So my site is called Qualia Computing, and it came about. I would say my intellectual legacy is kind of like David Pearce and the Abolitionist Project. This is a British philosopher who basically advocates the elimination of suffering with biotechnology. And but he also has a lot of well-developed theory of consciousness, and basically I'm just taking what he has further. And one of the things that talking to him made me realize, I should probably add a little bit of background. So I used to be a hardcore computationalist of consciousness. I used to think that yes, if you could just like program a computer right, it would just be conscious. And I thought the singularity was imminent for that reason. Recursively self-improving loops being the main building block in this case. And I think there's definitely something in that space. However, the key thing that consciousness does that a digital computer cannot do is this thing that's called phenomenal binding. The fact that on any given moment, your experience contains many pieces of information at once. It's irreducible in that sense. It's not irreducible in the sense that you cannot put equations on it and describe it mathematically. Because that would be called algorithmic reduction. Consciousness is definitely algorithmically reductive. But it's irreducible in the sense of you cannot just make sense of it in terms of atoms moving around. There's like a fundamental unity to consciousness. And that fundamental unity seems to be doing computationally useful things. And one way... Yeah. So one straight example is when the unity breaks down. So there's this problem called simultagnosia. This is kind of the extreme case where people can look at a picture and they see colors and textures, but they only see one object at a time. Basically, they can focus on a part of their visual field, and it's like, oh, there's a carpet there. It's like, oh, there's a bottle there, and so on. But it's extremely confusing. It's very hard for them to navigate the world because they don't see a bunch of objects around. They just see one object at a time. So that would be a particular kind of binding breaking, which is global binding of local binding. And yeah, there's a whole set of vocabulary to talk about the different kinds of binding. Another one is schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia tend to be it's a very maladaptive mental illness. It's adaptive. The genes that lead to schizophrenia are probably adaptive in small amounts, but very maladaptive in high amounts. Because I mean, it may enhance creativity in small amounts, but yeah, it makes you suffer quite a lot and not making sense of high amounts. And they seem to have like intertemporal binding problems, which basically leads them to have like a broken sense of self. Like the self of one moment to the self of the next moment, they're not put together properly. This is also common in dissociative disorder and depersonalization, derealization. Yeah, there's like a lot of examples of common mental illnesses that can be described as failure of binding of one sort or another. Yeah, but one of those in the case of humans is empathy, being able to model others. Because you need to, in order to model others, you need to model a whole other internal state that has its own richness. And be able to find in what ways you resonate and in what ways you have dissonance with that other state. And then, in the case of somebody like Shakespeare, you have, not only fourth or fifth order, like you actually have like sixth order intentionality. It's like, what does she think about what he said, about what he did, about what she thought, right? And this is extremely computationally demanding. I mean, part of my research when I was in my master's was figuring out how to model this, basically how to model the recursive structure of pragmatic reasoning, and it's very hard. I do think, however, that a lot of these things can be mimicked with AI, especially deep learning and other systems. But in the realm of consciousness, like for example, finding out new states of consciousness that are hyper-valuable, that is something you need consciousness for. And like that is something you will not be able to, David Pearce says something like, how do you make a supercomputer find a blissful state, a new blissful state? The supercomputer creates genetic code that creates a person, and then the person explores the states of consciousness and reports back. So, but the computer couldn't do it itself. Yeah. Yes?
Regarding some of the stuff you were saying about trying to increase the number of burners out in the world and the COMT gene,
yes.
Have you looked into stuff like related to the theories about Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon and how Neanderthal societies are a little bit more overall inclusive and
how the Cro-Magnons are a little bit more into pair bonding, and how that may have influenced the whole concept of openness versus trying to replicate and be more associated with the ego?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I haven't looked deeply into that particular case, but yes, the research that I've superficially seen seems to show that, yeah, Neanderthals were much more communal. Maybe like more like bonobos as opposed to chimpanzees. And yeah, I'm sure, yeah, genetically they probably were more empathetic, but for that reason probably more naive to other game theories. And yeah, I mean, like the current state of humanity is like this balance of, you know, you need to pass some tests in order to actually be part of the community, and there's accountability, and there's, but yeah, I mean, with a much more intelligent and purposeful, deliberate design of our states of consciousness, we could probably create large communities of just pure cooperators with very strong boundaries and detectors against defectors. So, yeah. Yeah.
You spoke earlier about how there are genetic receptors associated with how a person might metabolize or experience a substance such as MDMA.
Yes.
What is the evolutionary reason for that? Why would the genes develop differently?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question and super subtle. So I mean, there's lots of reasons, but like here's an example. It's like, why is the receptome, the human receptome, so diverse? It's like, why don't we all have the same receptors in the same proportion? Which could make sense. I mean, like there might be some kind of like optimal local maxima of like receptor densities, but there's a good reason. Evolution seems to be playing with the hedonic knobs, the kind of like the tuning knobs of pleasure and pain across societies. And one explanation is that we are very social animals. And when you have very social animals with a hierarchical or semi-hierarchical structure, you have these emergent effects where if you are the alpha male, your strategy that wins is going to be very dominant. You know, have like polygamy as well. You know, as many women as you can, as many kids as you want. Okay, if you're not the alpha male, you could try to be the alpha male, but that strategy doesn't work because the alpha male is going to kill you. Okay, so that's just not going to pass in genes. If instead what you have is some kind of a trigger mechanism and general distribution of genes in the genetic pool, such that if you suspect you're not the alpha male, you switch into a beta male or delta male strategy, where basically you avoid conflict. You just go with the flow and hope that at least you get one partner and you have 2 kids. And that strategy will leave copies of the genes. So when you have, yeah, in basically communities that are semi-hierarchical, having a multiplicity of receptors and various mood strategies really pays off. So yeah, it's for a very interesting, tricky reason. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking. I'm a big fan of your mind. I think it's really special the way that you've laid this out. Although, Derek, God knows most of it has gone over my head. But my question is about, and you spoke a little bit about dominance, and what it evokes for me is this feeling of proprietorship that comes with this elevation of levels of consciousness. And if there's an inherent hierarchy in the ways that people progress through this staging, you know, one of my fears, or maybe it's just a paranoia, is what I've seen is people have created a kind of cattle on which they can raise their society and their civilization. Whether it's domesticating animals to become workers for them, or whether it's by domesticating actual cows to be food. And I wonder if in the effort to dominate over this replicating other, if consciousness is at a risk of creating its own, you know, hierarchy much like that, and if those cattle end up being humans themselves. What do you think about that, and do you think that's actually a risk?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I would start out by saying that I mean, the idea of a hierarchy tends to cause negative feelings. It definitely causes strong negative feelings in me. Probably people in burners as well in general. But that may be a temperamental thing. There's people who are totally okay with a hierarchy. And the evolutionary strategy that works best is that probably people feeling okay with it is probably what's going to happen. That said, I do think there's ways to overcome it. So let me kind of like paint a picture of maybe like consciousness winning. So you would have basically this thing I call wiki consciousness. It's basically this repertoire of all of the experiences that everybody has had. So basically this is a future where mind melding is possible. You can connect your thalamus to somebody else's thalamus. You can become one entity with that person. And then you can also connect to wiki consciousness, which functionally works as God, basically, just like this super sentient intelligence that gathers all of our experiences. I mean, a lot of people who are spiritual would say that's already happening. You know, like we were born and then we die and then we give out our karma and our experiences to the higher self. I'm agnostic about that. I think it's unlikely, but I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think we could make it real. There's no reason why to waste any memory at all. And then in addition, because wiki consciousness has all of these different this wide repertoire and this formal mathematical understanding of consciousness, it also gives you the freedom to experience any state of consciousness you want. So now the other thing that comes with this is open individualism. It's like you maybe feel like a separate individual entity alone in the universe. You connect with wiki consciousness and you realize, oh, actually I'm also God. Everybody's God. It's just this one line of consciousness. So I'm okay incarnating temporarily as this link in this very large network, doing my function. Just like, you know, a liver cell may do its job best if it's not trying to become a brain cell. Now, I think that works best when you have the option of remembering who you truly are, because you don't feel permanently isolated. You don't feel like it was imposed on you. You did it out of your own free will. So that's like one scenario. And in this case, actually, what the whole society would be trying to achieve is explore the state space of consciousness. I mean, similar to the part of the economy right now that is based on trading information about the state space of consciousness, you know, like movie makers, these people who make designer drugs, or writers and artists. You know, they're trading resources for sharing very valuable experiences with others. In this place where consciousness won, the entire use of resources is utilized for exploring the state space of consciousness for the benefit of just everybody and the free access of it. So yeah, and in that sense, yeah, you could have a hierarchy, but it would be an okay hierarchy because it's optional. You can always remember your God.
So you're at Burning Man right now. Do you see that as more of an experience of resonating or metronoming?
Oh, I think it's a very good combination of the two. I think people are in a very resonant state. They're like very willing to and open to resonate with art and others. The people who planned the art definitely, crafted their own idea, but they were inspired by other art from previous years. So I would say it's like the seamless blend between them. I think it's like a success case of both worlds. Yeah.
Hello, hi. Just two quick comments on the question. The first is the replicators versus consciousness argument. It seems to kind of fall down a bit in the game you're trying to avoid, like a win-lose game, in that it kind of neglects some of the systems thinking of diversity and non-linearity that actually that cohort of our humanity is integral to this part of our humanity. The one can't exist without the other. The only reason that it is we're talking about it is because it's something to talk about. So to set up that we're now in a win-lose game is kind of falling into the trap that you're kind of speaking to avoid. And and not just in systems theory, but in the Buddhist notion of pratitya samutpada, the dependent co-origination, that the reason why we think in the way we do is because of that. So if there was nothing to talk about, if there wasn't there, we wouldn't have anything to talk about. The second is a comment is in terms of MDMA deaths. This is in my province in Ontario, Canada. 85%. Last time I looked, this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, were East Asian origin. people who died from MDMA toxicity. And it could just be one dose, actually. So it's some people doing research on it that there's an enzymatic deficiency that's similar to alcohol dehydrogenase in this population. So it could be a metabolism thing, not a particular valence of your awareness or consciousness, why or you wouldn't feel a particular way. So the third and my question is, win, lose game or not, I'm with you in terms of elevating and enlightening and opening up to the empathetic knowledge that we are intertwined in a way that hurting you is hurting myself. That's something that I deeply feel to be true. However, at this stage of our existence as humanity, the people who you're describing as replicators or who are uninterested in growing in this particular way have amassed weapons and money and legal power that it's so Byzantine. I can't even participate in the political process properly to make large-scale changes. And now there's more and more growing clear that we don't have a luxury of time. So my question is, how does does violence play into this? And I don't mean necessarily hurting other people, but taking over, not allowing this to continue in a way, and I wonder if you have a comment on that or you thought about it.
Yeah. Temperamentally, I'm extremely nonviolent. I mean, probably most of my life I would describe myself as a pacifist just by principle. And I think generating the consciousness of pacifism is very good. I mean, I love that consciousness. I love Jainism for that reason, just like extreme commitment to nonviolence. That said, in some situations, I think it's important to react appropriately. That said, it should be minimized as much as possible, precisely because it can lead to, basically runaway scenarios where violence replicates more violence. Several of the approaches that are in line are things such as basically appealing to greed, for example, or appealing to jealousy, in order to lure people who are very powerful into having ecstatic experiences. So it's kind of if you describe MDMA to somebody who's really powerful with lots of weapons and lots of money as something that makes you love everybody, they would probably have an immediate memetic immunity against doing it. If you describe it as something that's going to give you really great sex, then you may actually lure them into it. So I think we should probably have a bureau of misinformation for that purpose. Just like the things that are really good for consciousness, present them as complete debauchery for those who need them the most. Yeah. Question.
What technologies or other social trends in the near term are you most enthusiastic about?
Yeah, the core things that I'm looking into are, psychedelics. It sounds like beating a dead horse, but no, but I think something like 5-MeO DMT that when physicists actually start to explore what the hell is going on there, they're going to have a field day, and then it's going to transform the world completely. I think, and that's one of the things you can see in my writings. That is that rather than just saying hey, psychedelics are ineffable, I actually try to explain in as much detail as possible actually how you can reconstruct the psychedelic experience from more basic phenomena. Tracing being one of the key components, as well as symmetrification. And annealing. So psychedelics for the purpose of understanding valence, and then MDMA. And then the other one is electromagnetic and transcranial magnetic stimulation. Things like the research of Michael Persinger, the God helmet. The God helmet